It is Monday, December 9th, 2018. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with a special installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Joining me today is Mr. Greg Bluestein. Mr. Bluestein is a political reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, where he covers local, state, and national politics. You can read his work in the print version of the AJC, as well as the Political Insider blog and the comprehensive Politically Georgia subscription site. He can also be heard on the Politically Georgia podcast, and he's a regular on GPB's Political Rewind with Bill Nigut. Prior to coming to the AJC, Greg worked as a reporter for the Associated Press and the Fulton County Daily Report. He is the former editor-in-chief of the Red and Black and a proud graduate of the University of Georgia's Grady School of Journalism and the School of Political and International Affairs. Thank you very much, Greg, for taking time out of your busy schedule. Bill always calls you the hardest working man in the news business here in Georgia, but we really do appreciate you taking the morning.
Of course.
Well, since this is your first time sitting down for a Two-Party Georgia interview, tell me a little bit about your childhood upbringing, your education, things like that.
So I grew up in Sandy Springs, a son of a teacher and a doctor, a lung doctor. My dad always used to make the joke whenever he saw someone smoking, that person's paying for your bar mitzvah. So I never smoked as a result. My dad also had Parkinson's disease, so it also gave me like a unique insight to growing up with an ailing father. Mm-hmm. But around the time I was in fourth grade at the Greenfield Hebrew Academy, it's now known as the Atlanta Jewish Academy, I had a guest at the I guess their version of like a tag honors program. Speaker, his name was I.J. Rosenberg. He was the Braves beat writer, and that was just as the Braves were going from worst to first. And I don't remember what I.J. Rosenberg said, but all I remember is that was somewhat of a turning point in my life. Mm-hmm. From then on, I decided against being a doctor and toward being a reporter. And
how did your mom and dad take that?
Dad never really wanted me to be a doctor, but then he got hurt, I think, that I didn't want to be a doctor. Mom was always into reading and writing, so she was like, "Oh, this could be neat." And I ended up getting an AJC subscription. I had to swear that I would read more than the sports section every morning, and I did.
That's what all the cool kids were doing.
Exactly. Back then, there was actually such thing as a newspaper subscription.
Right.
But around middle school, I decided again I wanted to be a doctor. So because my mom told me that I had to learn how to type to be a reporter, so that was too daunting for me. Since I'll do something easier, I'll go back into try to be a doctor. It didn't go so well. I took all these AP chemistry and all these physics and all these science classes in high school. Did really badly on them. And I was dating a girl. She was my best friend. Her name was Jessica Schiffman in high school. And her father worked for CNN. And I remember being at her house hanging out. And her dad comes rushing in. And this is 1988. And he comes rushing in. He goes, "Jessica, Greg, I need you guys to come with me to the office. Something big is happening." So we jumped in his car. Jessica was kind of rolling her eyes like, "Dad, don't embarrass me." But I was all in it. I was like, "Yeah, let's go to CNN." And it was Kosovo bombings. It was the time.
So 98.
98, yeah.
Okay.
I talk fast, sorry.
That's all right.
1998, it was the Kosovo bombings. And I went and was hanging out at CNN, and I said, "Wow, this is amazing." I knew I didn't want to be a TV guy, but I wanted to.
Any reason why?
I just didn't. I liked writing, and I didn't want to have to necessarily be,
Gotcha.
on air all the time and do all that. And from then on, I joined the North Springs High School Oracle, and I joined the Red and Black here in Athens, as you mentioned earlier, and then a bunch of internships all through college and afterwards. And I covered, at the Associated Press, I covered pretty much every big breaking story around the Southeast. I'd go to the Gulf oil spill and mine explosions and murders and hurricanes and tornadoes and all sorts of things. And I covered legal affairs for 7 years. I covered every execution in Georgia for a period of time, including Troy Davis.
Troy Davis, I remember that.
So I covered a lot of that. But I also covered the legislature. And in 2012, when the AJC had a job opening covering business, they basically said, "We have a job for you, but it might not be what you might change your roles after a few months." They didn't tell me what they had in mind for me. But I think they knew that I had all this experience covering politics too. And in 2012 and on, I've been the AJC's political guy, at least one of them.
So you majored in journalism and political science.
Yeah.
So were you were you drawn to politics? Did you grow up in a politically, active or attuned family? Where does that interest in politics come from?
I think I was personally drawn to politics, but it was not because of my upbringing. Like I don't think, I don't want to throw my mom or dad under the bus. I don't think they even voted because they didn't want to get jury duty. We did not have very spirited conversations about politics around the dinner table or anything like that. But I did get involved. I did get interested in politics at an early age. I remember running for class president. I think it was 2000, and there was a George Bush, like sort of circle with it said Bush for president, and one of my friends took the word Bush out and wrote Jew. All over my high school, there was my picture with the circle thing saying Jew for president, and everyone thought it was funny. But I was on student council and all that. I learned early on from here at UGA, thankfully early on, not to, if I wanted to be a political reporter, not to get involved in political parties. So I remember sitting in, this was, Conrad Fink was the, hands down the most influential journalism professor that I had.
Right.
Great journalism professors up and down the board, but Conrad Fink was a life changer for me, and kind of helped stamp out any sort of, like even today when I go to things as a participant, as a crowd member, not as a reporter,
right.
Even sporting events, I have to remind myself I can clap, right? Because you're so attuned to being objective, dispassionate, neutral observer of politics, and not anyone who's involved.
Right.
And another game-changing professor of mine was Charles Bullock, and I remember sitting in his classes in 2002, and the people who were in my rows, who were sitting behind me or in front of me, were the people who are now running Brian Kemp's campaigns and running for state legislative gigs and being their political operatives or lobbyists or you name it. And I just remember early on just wanting to be a political reporter. I knew that I didn't know that wasn't. I didn't want to necessarily go right out and do it. Mm-hmm. And at the time, you were starting to see some like mobile journalists who would just jump on, like spend the next year or two just following a campaign. I didn't necessarily want to do that because I wanted to be with my family and all that, and my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife. But I did have an interest early on, at least in trying to do this, and it's kind of cool that I'm actually fulfilling both of my majors.
That's very unusual.
Yeah, my actual major at UGA in Grady was newspapers, so newspapers and poli-sci. They don't have a newspapers major anymore, but
well, unfortunately, it's a sign of the times.
Yeah.
But what do you remember about your time as editor-in-chief here at the Red and Black? What is that experience like? Because I think a lot of people hear the student newspaper, they think, what do you cover? SGA elections, things like that.
And we did.
Well, one of the stories, I'm sure. But what else do you remember, and how did that sort of influence or inform your later career?
Quick note on SGA. One of my first big scoops was writing about an SGA committee chairman who was not a student. So you had an SGA official, student government official, who was not a student. I'll never forget this about the Red and Black. I knew that I wanted to work for the Red and Black. Mm-hmm. I wanted to give myself a first semester where I got to acquainted with the campus before I jumped headfirst into the Red and Black, because I knew that I would be all in. So I took the first semester to do pledging at my fraternity and to kind of get acquainted and learn campus. And then second semester I joined. And at the time, you didn't get into Grady Journalism School until you were a sophomore or junior. So okay. I was a freshman. But I knew about Fink. I knew the legend of Fink. And I was too nervous to go see him myself. But I knew that he had a knack for summoning students who sparked his interest. And I went through the sort of traditional rigmarole and wrote a few early stories for the Red and Black. And I wrote a couple front page stories, and one of them caught Fink's attention. And I remember going to the Red and Black's office in downtown Athens at the time. It was on the second floor above a coffee shop called Espresso Royal Cafe.
Yeah. Jittery Joe's now.
Jittery Joe's now, and it was this creaky office, and beautiful, beautiful views of campus, but a very, very old office. Everywhere you walked, you'd hear, you kind of expect to see roaches come out of the walls and things like that. The assistant news editor said, "Whatever you've done it now. Fink wants to see you." And I was so nervous. And I remember clutching my red and black, whatever the edition of the red and black that was, clutching it in my hands and walking to his second floor office at Grady College and going into a very nondescript room, opening the door, very small, cramped office, full of news clippings on the walls and pictures of black and white pictures of his former students over the last couple decades. And I can't tell you, my heart was racing, and I'm clutching this red and black. And I go sit down, and Fink takes one look at me, and he snatches the paper from my hands, and he points at it, and he goes, "This is the most important thing you can do in your 4 years here at UGA." Throws it at me. "Now get out of my office." I was like, okay. But I got out, but the thing is, I kept coming back after that. And I'd see him at least once or twice a week, and especially I made point to go on days, even if I didn't have his class, and I often didn't have his class that semester, but even I'd go on days that I had a front page article. And back then it was a Monday through Friday paper, so 5 days a week. And I'd go, and he'd sometimes rip me a new one, right? He'd tear me up. He'd take his red pen out and say, "Bluestein, why'd you do this? Why didn't you ask this person? Why didn't you do this?" And he knew, right? He knew that we were students trying to learn. He knew we had probably an hour and a half to write the story. And if we got beat by the Banner Herald or the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, it was because they had a reporter working on it all day. And here I was trying to scram it in between two different classes.
Right.
But he made you better because of it.
Sure.
And he reminded me something too. He reminded me of the people who I'm covering now, the SGA presidents, the head of the Young Democrats or college Republicans, were going to be people who I would be covering a long time from now as well if I was still in journalism. And he was right. I mean, I see the people I cover all the time, including right here in Athens. He also encouraged me to be the editor of the Red and Black. And imagine being 19, 20, 21, never having a managerial role ever, right? Suddenly being in charge of 100 people, plus dozens more of contributors and stringers and that kind of thing. And being in charge of being a student leader of a giant organization. Of course, we still had full-time staff. We had a full-time publisher and advisors and ad directors, but they were hands-off in a way, in a good way. They said, "The newsroom is yours. You guys go cover it." And we had some giant stories. At the time, this was 2003 and 2004, there was full-time battling between the Athletic Association and President Michael Adams at the time. There was a controversy with Jim Herrick, the basketball coach, and Tony Cole, a basketball player, that resulted in the Dogs not accepting an NCAA bid to the tournament. There's all sorts of, but the biggest thing, and there was budget cuts too that required dozens, I think about a dozen university staffers to be laid off and many, many more positions to be unfilled.
Right.
And this was really one of the biggest. This was around the post 9/11 recession.
Right.
And it was a really rough time for the university. And a new governor, Sonny Perdue, who did not have the same sort of institutional underpinnings the Democrats had because they were in charge for so long. And this was a new governor who was trying to kind of navigate the budget process and went to war with the regents because many of the regents were appointed by his predecessor, Roy Barnes. So it was a very tumultuous time, and we had a blast. It was so much fun running that paper and writing those stories.
So what was it like going from the Red and Black to your first full-time gig? Was that at Associated Press or?
It was at the Daily Report.
Daily Report.
I had a bunch of internships in college, and I always took the lesson really early because sometimes I'd see seniors who didn't have any internships and were just kind of floundering for a job, and I knew I wanted to be in by senior year. I knew I wanted to be in Atlanta to be with my dad, be near my dad who was sick, and my now wife, her whole family's in Atlanta. So I knew I at least wanted to start my career in Atlanta. I didn't know I'd want to end it there too, but I do. But back then I knew at least I wanted to start it there. And I had internships with the Wall Street Journal and the Savannah Morning News and the AJC and the Associated Press. I just loved the AJC internship, but they made it very clear in the middle of the internship that no matter what you do, no matter how great you are, you ain't getting a job here for 5 or 6 years. Fink, and then this was to all the interns. It was just a blanket sort of.
I think they
policy.
told Galloway the same thing back in the 70s.
Exactly. It was. We don't hire people unless they have 5 years of experience. It's a destination paper, not a starting. Which it's different now, but it was what it was then. AP was different. I had an internship at AP that Fink really prodded me to push for, and AP had a program where basically they if you had a good internship, you were going to get a 1-year gig somewhere, and that 1-year gig could lead to a full-time gig. It might be in Montgomery, Alabama. It might be in Tucson. It might be somewhere you're not expecting to go. But if you do a good job, you're going to get a 1-year sort of. They didn't call it a fellowship, but it was kind of like a fellowship. And I went into that AP internship, guns blazing. I had a long list of story ideas. I was going to bang them out. I was going to get as many what they called A-wire stories as possible. I was going to get on the national wire. And I did. I had a good internship. But in the middle of the internship, they called all the interns globally to New York, and we had this we had a great time. We had all these fancy restaurants. But then I remember one by one going into some high-ranking executive's office, and they told each of us that, hey, remember that whole promise that you were at a 1-year gig? You've done a great job, but no one's getting that this year. And so we all had to kind of reassess and figure out what we're going to do. And for me, I never really thought about going to law school or going to grad school or anything like that. But I did have to kind of scramble and find another gig. And this was, I had already graduated from UGA, obviously, and I had signed a 1-year lease for, this seems like such a pittance, but for $420 a month to live in Buckhead with 2 roommates. So it wasn't, that's like Athens prices around back then too. Yeah. So it wasn't that much money, but to me it was everything, right? And I had signed this lease and I made a commitment and I didn't want to have to move. So I applied for a job with the Atlanta Business Chronicle, knowing a little bit about them, and I was still at the AP at the time. I still had a couple more weeks, and they were fully, say, hey, if you get a job, go for it. Leave the internship early. So I'm still working, but I applied for this job, go in for an interview, and I think I had a pretty good interview, and they called me back for another interview, and then they called me a couple days later and said, hey, you were our runner-up. We hired someone who's much more veteran than you. Her name is Rachel Tobin. She just left the Daily Report. Maybe you should go apply for a job there. I had never heard of the Daily Report, but it turns out it's somewhat red and blackish. It was a 5-day, Monday through Friday paper, very specific crowd, like the Red and Black was a university crowd. This was a legal crowd. The judges, lawyers, courthouse workers, they all read it religiously. So I applied for that job and got it and covered for about a year DeKalb County and the legislature.
Okay, so you were there for a year, and then you go back to AP from there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Another thing that Fink always encouraged me to do, and every other mentor I've had is, hey, be aggressive and don't let people, go after the gig you wanted. And I was hooked on AP. I mean, I wanted to be an AP reporter. I wanted to be in the Fink mold. I wanted to be a hard-charging. I didn't think I wanted to be a war correspondent like Fink was, but I wanted to be a part of breaking news all over Georgia and the South. And back then, I really wanted to be a Southern correspondent. I wanted to travel the fires and hurricanes and write really interesting yarns about Southern towns. And
like the old Claude Sitton in New York Times.
Yeah, I just wanted to be able to go, and I did a little bit of that there. But I was really aggressive about reminding them that I was still right around the corner. And one of the things I think Fink obviously helped me, and so did the network of Finksters at the AP, because there was a lot of them back then. There's a lot of Fink proteges at the Associated Press, so it always bugged them. I always bugged the news editor in Atlanta. I'd send him stories. I wasn't too nudgy, but I'd send him stories like, hey, I just want to let you know that here's you guys couldn't do a big story on this because it's not really in your audience. It's not a statewide thing, but for our audience, this is a big deal. And the day of the courthouse shootings, which was in March of 2005, I'm driving to the courthouse, which is the Daily Report's office is right next door to the Fulton County Courthouse in downtown Atlanta.
Makes sense.
So I'm driving in, and this time though, instead of just driving to find my parking space, I'm dodging like police cars. There's just police are swarming the area. I have no idea what's going on. It was pre, Twitter and getting 7 million text messages anytime anything happened. And so I park the car and walk right outside, and I start asking what's going on. And I remember there was actually people celebrating the fact that a judge got shot because their court hearings were delayed. But most people were already just in shock that a judge, and what we ended up finding out, a judge in the courthouse and a deputy and a court reporter were all shot at the Fulton County Courthouse. And so I immediately called my office first, just to let them know that, hey, this is happening and I'm here. And they already knew about it, and there were several people there. And then I called the Associated Press because they weren't competitors. The Daily Report was not a competitor of the AP.
Sure.
And I said, hey, guys, you need to have someone down here. This is actually happening. And I don't think they were aware of it yet. And it's not the reason I got hired or anything like that, but it did. They were very thankful that that someone was kind of nudging them. This is a giant, huge story, and it was the biggest story of the year in Georgia, probably, and a terrible, still haunting sort of story of how that can happen. But I got hired 2 or 3 months after that, and after even more aggressive nudging, and I got
I'm
hired
noticing a theme.
Yeah, exactly. And I got hired to cover the weekend shift,
Okay.
and Monday through Wednesday, and I was going to make the most of it. And on the weekends, I did the weekend shift, but I'd work days I was off. I'd work nights. I did everything I could to try to get a beat that I wanted, and I ended up getting the legal affairs beat and covering environment, and then I also covered the legislature with our crew at the Capitol.
Did you cover elections with that as well?
Yeah, I wasn't the main guy in elections because it was Dick Pettis, the legendary, the dean of the Georgia State House. We only overlapped a few months. He quit shortly after I got hired. I remember I was going on a cruise with my wife, and I got a phone call from the office saying, "Holy crap!" It was a shock. Dick was going to retire in a few years, but he wasn't going to leave early. Everyone thought, but he left to basically start up a new newsletter. A precursor to like the digital outlets you see today. Mm-hmm. It was Dick Pettis' newsletter.
Like the Tom Crawford route.
You got
basically.
it. And in some sense, Tom sort of inherited that role before his passing. So Dick stayed at the Capitol, but it was left the AP, and we hired one of my now colleagues at the AJC, Shannon McCaffrey. So she was the main State House correspondent, and I was down there for 3 or 4 months a year helping her with the legislature. And I helped with elections. But at the AP, even back then, now there's only a handful of people in the Bureau. Back then there was a lot. There was still 20 or so people. But we still were very sort of differentiated. And truthfully, for the AP, it's very a centralized sort of operation from New York, and it's what the New York editors care about. And a lot of times it's the scandalous stuff. It's the murders and shootings and crime and the big breaking news. And so the AP world kind of valued that, at least then, heavily. And so I wanted to get on A-Wire. So I didn't mind not getting Dick. I didn't apply for Dick's role or anything like that. I wasn't presumptuous enough to think I'd get it. But I wanted to help out in some form. So I do the breaking news and I do the big legal write-ups and things like that. And it also helped with the legislature and help Shannon any way she could.
Okay, so you would have been covering the legislature when Speaker Ralston sort of emerged out of the scandal in the speaker's chamber and things like that. Is that the time period we're talking about?
You got it. I covered
07, 08, 09.
Yeah. Well, my first session was actually 04. I'd be back and forth from Athens covering some of the session for the Red and Black about Hope Scholarship, about what university audiences cared about.
Right.
And then 05 for the Daily Report, I spent a huge portion of that session getting to know David Ralston, because back then he was I don't want to get it wrong, he was the judiciary chair of, was it non-civil? There was civil and non-civil. I can't remember if he was non-civil, but to the Daily Report, the Judy committee was everything. And so I wrote God knows how many articles about tort reform and about ending unanimity to death penalty cases and all these legal issues that your average outlet, AJC, AP, whoever, would write about, but not devote 50 column inches to joint and several liability.
Don't get into the weeds on this stuff, yeah.
I wrote 50 column inches about joint and several liability and things like that, venue change and all these things that felt like a crash course in getting a law degree.
Yeah.
Also convinced me not to get a law degree.
Well, that's almost as helpful sometimes.
Yeah, yeah.
So what was the first campaign that you really covered like you would today?
That would probably be, because I covered some of the 6 campaign and some of the 8 campaign and 10 and 12, but the one that I first became like the go-to guy at the AJC for was 14.
Okay.
And that was Jason Carter versus Nathan Deal re-election. Again, I covered plenty of the 10 campaign, but I wasn't doing it full time.
Okay.
So it was 2014. I got the AJC political full-time gig.
Yeah, how did that come about?
In January of 13. So I've been at the AP for 7 years, was a lot of issues there, and wasn't particularly happy with my direct manager, but that wasn't even the reason I left. I always wanted to work for my hometown paper.
Right.
I wanted more time to write stories. I wanted more freedom and flexibility. And I wanted to have a little bit more impact in the writing. I mean, AP goes far and broad, but sometimes it seemed like your own backyard didn't really read it. It didn't have, you'd have these big scoops that you thought were game changers, and they'd run in the front page of the Chicago Tribune, but they get sort of overlooked in Metro Atlanta, and
Right.
that
would get old.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then especially for a guy who doesn't want to go to Chicago or New York.
Right.
Like, I wanted to stay here and be a part of the community that I grew up in, that I'm so proud to be a member of. So it did get old. And also there was all these institutional issues. I remember going to Fink shortly before he died, and I told him that I was leaving his beloved AP, and he goes, "You got to go." I mean, he said, "Don't even blink." He said, it's not the AP that I grew up in, and it's not the AP that even you grew up in. So I left for the AJC it was an economic development job. They wanted me covering business and commercial real estate and economic development, and I don't know anything about commercial real estate, but I really liked the economic development part of the gig. So I applied. I got the gig. I went headfirst into it. I wanted to cover the redevelopment of underground Atlanta and the densification of the suburbs. I wrote these big thematic stories. I did an investigative story right when I got there about how the Beltline was misusing taxpayer dollars. I would do all these stories just about on the economic development side. And I do a few stories about, hey, this building is going up. Fine. It's cool. I like that stuff too, but I really like the economic development part of it. And after 6 months, one of my managers kind of sat me down, and I had no idea this was coming, and said, "Hey, we're looking to make a change. We're looking to open up a new position. You'd be covering the governor's office and politics." And I said, "Okay, cool. That sounds really great. And this is something that I've always wanted to do, but it doesn't sound like I really have a choice." And he goes, "No, not really. We want you for this gig, and we want you to want it, but we really would, you really don't really have
even
too
if you
much
don't."
interest." And I wanted it, and so that's when I got the right head first into it. And it was perfect timing because it was Deal's, I guess that would be his 3rd legislative session. He was starting to unveil some big platforms. There was a big ethics debate at the General Assembly about rewriting ethics rules. And of course, it was a ramp up to 2014 when Democrats thought that changing demographics and influx of people from outside of Georgia would change Georgia's political composition. And in a weird sort of turn of events, I knew Jason Carter, not just from the state Senate, but also his wife, Kate Carter, was the editorial advisor for the Red and Black when I was the editor-in-chief. It just goes to show you, as I was mentioning earlier with Bullock, and just you're in class with future Republican and future Democratic leaders of Georgia. Same thing just growing up in Metro Atlanta. My high school teacher's husband is the current chair of the Georgia GOP. So it's just this tangled webs we weave, and you can't let it influence your coverage. But so Jason ran for governor. Michelle Nunn was running for Senate. By then, I was a constant presence with Governor Deal. I mean, I showed up at every event that I possibly could have. I'd go to ribbon cuttings in Southwest Georgia. I'd read a little brief about the ribbon cutting, but I'd go to ask him about 6 other stories I was working on.
Right.
And then also to ask lawmakers and public officials down there about those 6 other stories I'm working on too. And so that was my first. And around that same time, Jim Galloway, another mentor of mine, although I don't know if he's ever heard me say that, but another, just a legend at the AJC, gave me and my colleague in Washington access to the Political Insider blog, which was a giant deal to us that we had access. We had earned the trust because he had run the blog basically solo since Tom Baxter left the AJC, and to have him give us the trust to kind of get the keys to the car, Dad, was fantastic. And so that helped us kind of cover the race in a way that we hadn't in the past. The AJC had always done really well at writing big takeout stories about those races and also covering the day-to-day. But the blog format gives you another outlet to do that in a way that you didn't have to try to shoehorn it into a big front page story or even in a smaller metro story.
Right.
You could write about, hey, I remember going to Athens for a Michelle Nunn event, and nothing really big came out of it. So I did a story saying, Michelle Nunn's listicle, 10 reasons that she wants you to vote for a moderate or Democrat. And it was just about her policy platform, stuff we could never do in print, but we could do for the blog.
Okay. So 2014, you sort of mentioned this, that was supposed to be this path-breaking election that was going to bring Democrats back into power, or if not relevance. Didn't happen, as you mentioned. But 2016, right around the corner. What was it like covering the 2016 election here in Georgia?
Yeah, that was like something else. I mean, because I'd gotten the whole 2014 daily grind experience and we kind of knew what was going to happen. I mean, the polls showed it close, but they also showed the governor. Even the final poll showed him at least 4 or 5 points.
Right.
And then, of course, he ended up winning by 8 points. And a moment I'll never forget about that campaign. I was on the bus with him. We had 4 reporters on the trail those last 2 weeks or so. We had a reporter with Nunn and with Carter and with David Perdue and with Governor Deal. And I was with Governor Deal, and I was on the bus with him. And I'll never forget, I don't know, it was like a week out, one of his aides walking to the back of the bus with a giant smile on her face. And she said, it's over. Whatever poll numbers they saw that morning solidified that the race had taken a turn, and that the close numbers, he was always up, but the close numbers had shot up. 2016 was different because we never really thought that Clinton would win Georgia. The Clinton campaign was not investing in Georgia whatsoever. We were very cautious about writing anything about. We always wrote about the Democratic side of things and how the Democratic energy was around Hillary Clinton, especially in the primary phase. But we also were cognizant of the fact that national Democrats weren't spending any time in Georgia. Hillary Clinton hadn't visited Georgia since the primary, and neither Donald Trump. Trump came down in Georgia in, I think it was early January or maybe it was February.
Yeah, Valdosta. Of all places.
Got, packed the place, and then had another 5,000 or 6,000 people waiting outside. And that also let him hit the Florida market too. So
it made Jacksonville.
Made perfect sense. But yeah, so Georgia wasn't on the national map. So that gave us a little more. And then the Senate race was bizarre too, because there was a lot of big names who were thinking about challenging Johnny Isakson. And then you end up getting this millionaire outsider who was not a very good candidate, Jim Barksdale, run. So it let us pay more attention nationally to the presidential race, and through a Georgia lens. And so me and my colleagues, we got to travel the nation covering the presidential race. So I was in Iowa, in New Hampshire, in South Carolina, in Wisconsin, in Ohio, and Nevada. You name it, we were there. We were at most of the debates. And it was really fun for me for the first time to be able to cover this on a national view, but through the Georgia lens. So we'd write about Georgians who were involved in the campaigns. We knew all the whole Rubio Georgia team. We knew the Trump teams. We knew the Bernie Sanders Georgia folks. I mean, we know all these guys back and forth. And when it got to the national conventions, that's where it really got fun, particularly the Republican one, because there was such a dominant Ted Cruz faction. And if you looked at, there was a lot of wrangling over delegates back then. And Donald Trump's chief delegate wrangler was a guy from Georgia named Brian Jack. And they were worried about a few delegations, Texas being the foremost, but other than Texas, they were worried about, and one of them was Georgia, because there was such a fervent Cruz faction in Georgia. And so it was really fascinating to be able to cover all that. And after when Trump won Georgia, he won by about 5 percentage points. The margin was a little bit more narrow than I thought it would be, but
Right.
no one was shocked that no one in our newsroom, or especially our political team, was shocked that Trump won Georgia. What was obviously the
Right.
shock was national.
Right. Well, was there a surprise, at least, that Hillary Clinton was able to carry Cobb County and Gwinnett County?
Yeah, that was to me the first of what I think we'll see. Time will tell, but will be a significant trend in Georgia politics. It was that she flipped Cobb, Gwinnett, and Henry too. I think Henry was a few tenths of a few
Right.
points, but Henry County as well. But Cobb and Gwinnett, I mean, you're talking like the backbone of the Republican Party of Georgia. I mean, Cobb being the one of the launching pads for Newt Gingrich, and of course Johnny Isakson. Gwinnett County being solidly, I mean, without a doubt, solidly Republican. I mean, almost an afterthought to statewide candites who take Gwinnett for a given. Not to say they didn't try there, but I mean, it was a Republican bastion.
Right.
And then having well, I was going to go into the 6th district stuff, but that's for
That's the next question.
Yeah.
So you already mentioned sort of the Georgia gang circling President Trump, or Donald Trump at the time, but plucks 2 Georgians into his cabinet, Sonny Perdue, agriculture, who's still there, and then Tom Price, who was 6th district representative as HHS secretary. So there was going to be that special election. You know, what was the outlook in the newsroom going into that special election? What were you anticipating, and then what did you experience?
Yeah.
Throughout that very long special election and then runoff?
Well, the run-up to that was there was really no room in Georgia Republican politics for a never Trumper, right? That had become very apparent the final months of the general in 2016, going into early 2017. And Tom Price was obviously thinking about a run for governor, and so were a lot of other statewide congressmen and also state officials. And I think Trump's victory kind of rejiggered that whole calculation. And suddenly Tom Price was looking at an HHS seat. We had a good sense that Sonny Perdue would get the agriculture seat later on, a few weeks later, but we didn't have a perfectly honed sense about Tom Price, and it was harder to kind of crack the Price network. But once he got that seat, and it was right around the holidays, and I remember before going on vacation, I did a story about the people who may run for Tom Price's seat in the Congress, and it was just a list of all the potentials. And I remember writing something to the effect of, this seat has been in Republican hands for decades. It's the same seat that launched Newt Gingrich and Johnny Isakson's careers. It's solidly Republican. A few Democrats are probably thinking about it, but you know, the attention is on the GOP side, which was true.
Yeah, right.
And I had this whole list of people, and some of them ended up running, some of them did not. But I remember getting a call from a Karen Handel ally who said, you should probably name Karen Handel on it just in case. And early on, we didn't think it was that big of a deal. It was something, of course, we were going to cover, and because we cover all Georgia politics. And so I covered some of the twists and turns early on, and people getting in and getting out. We were waiting for the Democratic field to shape up. I think really early on, a former Democratic state senator, announced his bid, and a guy that very few people had ever heard of jumped in. And I'm not talking about Ossoff, but he was also another guy that few people had ever heard of. And I was visiting a friend at a hospital, and as I was walking out, I get a call from Ossoff, and I never heard of him, didn't know him, and he goes, "Hey, I just want to let you know, I want to give you the scoop. I'm jumping in this race tomorrow. I've already got these endorsements lined up, Hank Johnson and John Lewis, and I've got $250,000 in cash I've already got committed." I said, crap, that's a lot of money. Little did I know that would be a peanut. But this guy's legit.
He's for real.
Yeah, $250,000, and this was January, I think. This was early. $250,000, man, this guy's on it. And so I did a story about him, and then a week or two later, Daily Kos announced that he had raised $1 million through their fundraising network. At the time, I think he was either the fastest or second fastest candidate to get to that 7-figure mark in Daley Casa's history. But you knew he was going to be a legit candidate. I remember not that long after, I'm still covering the session. I'm not full-time covering the 6th District at this point by any means. I'm still covering the session and Governor Deal and all this. And Ossoff's folks call me and say, hey, I'm doing a meet and greet at a local synagogue in the 6th District. And I show up and there's like 5 national reporters there. And I come back and I tell my editors, like, okay, we got to be all over this because we can't get beat in our own backyard. And that's what we did the next 3 or 4 months was I made it my life to cover this race. And compared to 16, where I'm all over Iowa and New Hampshire and the nation covering, this was fun for me because I'm in my backyard. I live in the 6th District.
You just go in the northern arc, well, not that there is a northern arc, but basically, that path.
Exactly. Like, look, I'm as 6th District as you can get. I grew up in Sandy Springs. I moved to Roswell in high school. I married an East Cobb girl, and I live in Dunwoody. Like, I've got the 4 corners of the 6th District set up. So there was one weekend where there was a debate and some fundraising event and a canvassing sort of volunteer event that I wanted to cover all 3 of them. I can walk to all 3 of them from my house. The guy who owns the jewelry shop next to my barber within a quarter mile of my house ran for Congress, right? Like these were people in our community. It was a very interesting race and it became all consuming.
It sounds like it was good. It was a precursor and good practice for 2018 with the amount of national attention and national focus on Georgia. Was that the case? Is that how you found it?
Yeah, except there was a tremendous amount of national attention on both, but the reason the 6th District was different was because it was the only race. I mean, you would have teams of national reporters. For us, it was pretty much, for a long time, it was pretty much just me and Galloway would help out on the analysis side. And then near the end, we had plenty of backup. But you'd see teams of Washington Post reporters come down, right, for all angles. And a lot of, it is what it is. A lot of reporters, including me, were writing a lot of the same variations of stories. We have to do we have a different role than the national outlets, obviously, because we have to write about policy and personalities in a way that they don't. They can just kind of write the big sweeping stories, and we have to do that as well. But we also have to kind of drill it down and how the races are impacting the community and all that. But yeah, it was a good sort of warm up. We got a tremendous amount of attention in 18 too, but we weren't the single focus of the nation's political class though, like we were in 17, because we were the only race on the ballot.
Well, what was the AJC's takeaway from that 2017 special election, the runoff, which was Handel winning by 4 points in Tom Price's seat that he had won by 15 or 16? The November 4.
Yeah, the postmortem was, hey, look, Democrats are clearly more competitive in the suburbs, but for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, and revving up Democrats also managed to rev up Republicans. And so I guess the takeaway from that race was it's still a Republican, and obviously in hindsight, but at that time, it's still a Republican district. It just showed you what happened when you get crazy levels of turnout on both sides. Republicans win because it's still a Republican-leaning district. And it got to the point where Ossoff wasn't trying to necessarily nationalize the race. He got in the race as a Make Trump Furious candidate. That was his tagline, Make Trump Furious. But he didn't go after Trump later on. He didn't bring down Nancy Pelosi or any other big national figures. In fact, Nancy Pelosi was used to batter him over the head nonstop throughout that race. While Karen Handel did campaign with Trump, campaign with Pence, campaign with Paul Ryan. So it also showed that no matter how Democrats try to not make a national race, it's a nationalized race. And the same thing happened with 2018. But the difference was, although Abrams also didn't bring up Trump relentlessly, I mean, this was a state-focused race, she was very open about bringing in Democratic stars from across the nation.
Even Will Ferrell.
But I'm also talking about Elizabeth Warren. And
Cory Booker.
Yeah, just about every 2020 presidential candidate except for Bernie Sanders, who endorsed her but never came down.
Interesting.
And Biden
he had
came
planned. to come down, but I think he
the rumor was that Biden
canceled.
was going to endorse Evans, but he ended up not endorsing her, and then endorsed Abrams after the primary. Came down for like a book event or something.
Something like that.
But it wasn't a rally with Abrams or anything like that.
Now, I think it was supposed to be right around when the Kavanaugh hearing was really blowing up.
Yeah, that was it.
So 2018, I mean, going back to the primaries seems like a lifetime ago. But what was the conventional wisdom going into the 2018 gubernatorial primary season?
So, yeah, it's a great question. So the gubernatorial campaign was revving up right as the 2017 special election was, right? So in between covering that, I'm like sitting down with the candidates.
There was a lot of overlap, yeah.
A lot of overlap. If Stacey Abrams and I sat down to talk about her decision to jump in the race, and it was embargoed for a day or two, but it was the same day as the Republican convention, the state convention.
Okay.
I think it was Augusta, where Michael Williams was getting in the race in a major way in the governor race, and Karen Handel was still there trying to rev up her core audience for her race. So this was all overlapping. Casey Cagle was about to get in the race. Brian Kemp already had gotten the race. I think he was the first major candidate to announce. They leaked me. I got the leak that he was going to announce, and then he announced 2 days later. So he got a nice pop out of that for a couple days. So they're all kind of overlapping, and at the time it was looking like the Democratic side of the party was going to be this sort of age-old debate, internal debate among Democrats about which approaches are going to work better. Going after maybe taking a page from the Jason Carter, Roy Barnes playbook, trying to go after moderate whites in the suburbs, trying to get them back in the Democratic fold, or the Stacey Abrams approach, which was energizing Democratic voters who rarely cast ballots in these midterms. But the thing about the Stacey Abrams approach is she ended up doing both, right? She ended up getting a bunch of the moderates in the suburbs. And the Republican side of it was a whole different ballgame, because you knew that there was no room in the Republican Party in Georgia at the time of all these candidates getting in the race for never-Trumpers, right? They had been kind of squashed out. Every leading candidate, every influential Georgia state politician was on the record and all over being supportive of Donald Trump. Even Johnny Isakson endorsed him and said, hey, this is about me. This is about my race. I'm running for re-election, but I'm supportive of Trump. But it was the question back then was, to what degree would they be pro-Trump? Because we didn't know what was going to happen through the midterm with Trump. There was rumors of investigations, and Democrats were talking about impeachment. All this stuff was happening at the same time. And so the big question, especially for Casey Cagle, is, can a guy, and he was obviously the lieutenant governor and the presumptive front runner, can a guy who was never an enthusiastic Trump supporter, who didn't endorse Trump until the convention, galvanize his core conservative audience without being, without looking like they're going overboard on Donald Trump? And Brian Kemp knew that was a big issue for Casey Cagle, and that's why when he got in that race, he made it all about Trump from the get-go, even down to his slogan, which is
Georgia first.
Georgia first.
So you've already touched on it, but you already mentioned Casey Cagle, the front runner. That's where the money was, the capital crowd, the lobbyists. That's where the smart money, the conventional wisdom was on Casey Cagle. Lieutenant governor since 2007. What happened?
Had been planning for a gubernatorial run for more than a decade.
Thought about jumping into the 2010 race, didn't. What happened to that campaign?
They actually jumped into the 2010 race and then jumped out of it.
That's right.
Started
had
back surgery, but it raised money for that and was all in for that one too. And he was looked at as having not just the Capitol crowd support and the establishment forces support. He was also looked at someone who could be seen as friendly enough to maybe that moderate's not the word, but friendly enough to moderate Republicans that
has a very attractive life story.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about someone who came from nothing. I mean, he grew up in trailers, moved just like Stacey Evans in her life story, moved multiple times throughout his life. Found a mentor early on in his life who helped him figure out his business sense after he played football in college. and started with the tuxedo shop, ended up becoming a banker, right? I mean, just a really inspiring story, especially to conservatives who liked his appeal. Came from a come-from-behind victory over Ralph Reed, who is supposed to be governor now, right? I mean, you're supposed to be talking about the second term of Governor Reed right now, I guess, because this was 2006, and Ralph Reed was at the peak of his popularity when a little-known state senator named Casey Cagle from Gainesville dared to challenge him, ends up beating him for the Republican nomination, and then sweeping to an easy victory.
06
in 2006 over the Democrat. So, a very compelling backstory there for Casey Cagle. Lots of money, lots of advisors. I mean, he had a huge campaign team. Was planning on this for more than a decade. Everyone and their mom knew that he was running. Like it was no secret that he was about to jump in the race for years. And he had been collecting these chits from people along the way, favors, and here I'll do this. And he was working his tail off. He was all over the state doing fundraisers for lawmakers and shoring up support. So he was the guy who was supposed to win it. The big question early on was, how big would he win it by?
Right.
I mean, was he going to be forced into a runoff? Was he going to win it outright with the 50+1% of the vote that he needed? And really, if you look at our coverage from that point, it was a lot about that. Is like, all the polls showed him in the 40s. Could he get to 50+1? Could he land that knockout blow? And even his team was thinking a little bit skeptically about it once we had given the size of the Republican field of 4 or so other prominent Republicans getting in. But look, when he made the infamous Delta move, to me, I thought, oh man, I mean, this guy might have just locked it down. I mean, there was a lot of talk in the Capitol at that point that he might have just won the race without a runoff. And that infamous Delta move, of course, is when he said that he would block a tax cut for jet fuel for Delta after Delta ended a group discount for the NRA. And this was in the wake of a school shooting in Florida, a horrific school shooting. And several companies, including Delta, were sort of telegraphing their concerns about the gun violence, and Delta did it by saying we're no longer going to offer this mass discount for NRA members that very few people were taking.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, we ended up finding out a week later or so when Delta released its details that it was affecting a handful of people, but it was symbolically a big deal. And this came in the backdrop of a Georgia legislature that was already kind of upset with Delta for wading into debates. Delta had waded into the religious liberty debate a few years earlier. They had very forcefully called for a transportation tax, raising more revenue for transportation so that not just Hartsfield, but the roads and connectors around the airports all over Georgia get more funding. So lawmakers were already kind of peeved at Delta. And so Casey found a lot of support for his step there. It didn't take long for even the governor to begrudgingly agree to this, to the death of the Delta tax break that he had forcefully supported earlier on there too. But yeah, it caught a wave of national news attention. It got Casey Cagle the NRA's endorsement. I mean, look, it looked pretty good for Casey Cagle there. Right before the primary, his poll numbers are still in the 40s. So he's looking at, unless I can pull off an crazy upset, unless I can get a surge, I'm going to be in a runoff. And if you look back at what he did then, the top 3 contenders were Brian Kemp from Athens, Secretary of State, Hunter Hill, a former state senator, and of course Cagle. And Hunter Hill was in second in some of those polls.
Right.
And he did not want to face Hunter Hill. It wasn't Kemp who he was afraid of, it was Hunter Hill. Hunter Hill is a former U.S. Army Ranger with a long military career. He served in combat. He was a young businessman as well. He was a quarterback in high school. He went to West Point. I mean, he was very attractive for a lot of Republican voters who weren't fans of Cagle. So Cagle started attacking Hill. He started a debate in forums and everything. He was attacking Hill's plan to cut the state's income tax and his lack of what he called his lack of experience, or his lack of as much experience as Cagle had. And he really helped prime the field for Brian Kemp. And meanwhile, at these forums, Brian's barely getting scathed by his opponents, and he's pouring money into a series of provocative ads that got a ton of national attention and lots of criticism, but also among the core Republican audience that votes in these low turnout primaries, it's going wildfire. I mean, they're loving all the attention they're getting. And he got the new catchphrase. What was it? It was,
yeah, I just said
yeah,
that.
it was, yep, I just said that. That was his, I can't forget that. He was back then he was an unapologetically politically incorrect conservative who said all the time, "Yep, I just said that," and he wasn't afraid to run those ads, even if it came back to haunt him, and they helped him a lot back then. They helped him surpass Hunter Hill. You could just feel near the end of that campaign that Hunter Hill was done for. And he was right there in the polls. He was in second place for so long. But near the end, you had outside dark money groups just sending streams of mailers attacking Hunter Hill's positions. And you had Cagle attacking him overtly. And Brian Kemp just soaking it all in.
Yeah, there's a term for that in politics. It's a sort of a ghoulish phrase, but murder-suicide, where the top two contenders attack each other and basically sink both their campaigns because they've given enough oxygen to the third place guy to move up. So Casey Cagle still, he had the most votes coming out of the primary, but I think it was under 40% in the primary.
I think it was at 39,
which is a real danger sign in a runoff. What were the key factors that gave Brian Kemp the boost in that runoff? Because I think the smart money still would have been on Casey Cagle at the beginning of the runoff, but this was a long 9-week runoff.
It was a 9-week runoff because of a federal court ruling.
Right.
So it was an exhausting runoff. I mean, there were several other states that hadn't held their primaries at the time of our primary that still had their runoffs before.
Because we were like May 24th,
it was May 24th and July 25th or something like that. Yeah. And so several states had the primaries after we did and had the runoffs before we did, right? It was nuts. But look, Cagle's campaign had prepared for this. They knew that they weren't going to get the 50. At that point, they knew they weren't going to get the knockout.
Right, because there were 5 candidates.
Yeah, so they were hiring up, and right after, that night, I think it was the night of their victory. If not, it was the day after. They started going negative on Kemp. They were calling him incompetent. They were attacking his not really his voting rights issues like the Democrats later attacked him for. It was more of what they called the mismanagement of that office.
A theme we would hear again.
Exactly. But not on the scale of on voting issues. It's more of, hey, this guy isn't really overseeing all these boards. He's not in the office that much. He's taking advantage of taxpayer perks, that kind of thing. And Kemp swung right back. Kemp called him an establishment sort of flaky Trump guy who the subtext of what Kemp always said was basically, I'll do the right thing even when no one's looking. And that Cagle was this kind of squeamy, slick politician guy. Yeah. And the biggest turning point in that race involved that issue, which was this Clay Tippins secretly recorded tape of Casey Cagle. And I remember getting a call from Clay, and I covered him during the campaign, but we kind of, he was always behind the polls. He was a really interesting character.
Oh, yeah.
He had never run for public office before. He was a Navy SEAL, a former Stanford swimmer, tall guy, booming voice, had all these interesting ideas that you knew wouldn't play well with the Republican electorate. He would have
been a great candidate back in the 80s or 90s.
Yeah, his no one can argue with his main focuses, which were ending, cracking down on sex predators and improving third grade literacy and expanding medical marijuana. Right, even a lot of hardcore conservative Republicans love those issues, but hard to run on those.
Not animating. Issues.
Yeah, they're hard to run on those, where the other guys are running on, yes, I'm going to sign religious liberty, I'm going to expand gun rights, I'm going to do yada, 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 right? This guy, he was also the only candidate that said he would not sign the religious liberty bill. So he had a sort of set of issues that were very counter to the rest of the other candidates. And also was just not a politician. And the day before the vote, he did a 24-hour Facebook Live that even showed him swimming in the morning for his practice. I mean, he sat down with Casey Cagle afterwards to talk about an endorsement. And for whatever reason, Casey Cagle's schedulers had the two of them in a room together alone, without a body guy or anyone else, from what I understand, and also gave him 90 minutes, which is a long time. And Clay Tippins turned on his iPhone, turned on his recorder, tucked it into his pocket. A couple days later, I got a call from Clay, and we had built a rapport up through the session. He saw me everywhere. I saw him everywhere. He wasn't one of those guys who was mad we weren't covering him as much as we were covering Cagle. He kind of got it. But I also made sure that, it's my job. I had to cover. Right. I cover all the candidates who were prominent candidates. And so I'd write about his policies all the time as well. And he called me up and said, "Hey, you're not going to believe this, but I've got this recording, and I'm going to let you listen to it." And so I went over to WSB's office. WSB was in the loop as well. And me and Richard Belcher, their investigative reporter, sat down with Clay and heard this tape. And I'm sitting there writing it out. And in real time, I'm letting my editors on Slack know, like, holy crap. I'll say holy shit, because it was bigger than holy crap. Holy shit, this is a big deal. That's good, right? I'm allowed to?
Yeah.
Okay. I said, this is a big deal. Like, this guy's going on the record. This is a game changer. With this tape, and Cagle can't deny it. I mean, it's his voice, where Cagle's saying several things, but one of them was saying that he tried to undercut. I'm trying to remember the exact thing because it was a while ago, but essentially that an outside group was going to spend millions of dollars to help Hunter Hill's campaign if he didn't pass what he called, if he wouldn't approve of what he called bad charter school legislation. And so that bill ended up becoming law, even though he said it was bad. And you have this covertly recorded tape with him saying that he was backing legislation that even he thought was bad. And I think his quote was 1 million times over. Like, he just thought it was this, he was very clear, he thought it was this bad legislation, but he had to do it to block another group from helping Hunter Hill.
Right.
Stuff that happens all the time in politics, right?
But nobody says it.
Yeah, right now there are meetings as we speak with lobbyists and lawmakers and whoever talking about blocking bills they don't like and supporting others. And maybe having a financial, maybe a threat of like, hey, we're going to help the other guy out if you don't do this. It happens. But we have never really seen it happen. We never really heard it, at least in Georgia in recent years, so vividly on this tape that this former candidate is so, you could call him brave or courageous or just foolhardy, whatever. There's lots of different names for him. But he did it. He came out, he gave us the tape. And it was the first it was a 90-minute recording. So the initial recording he gave us was about 5 minutes. There was other recordings where he said that basically, where Cagle said that he hated the Republican primary because there's a race for the craziest, right? I mean, stuff that pundits can say, but when you're the actual Republican candidate going after those voters, it's tough to call them crazy. And really for Cagle, it reinforced a negative image that many voters had of him, of being that slick guy who was willing to do anything,
right,
who was not the true conservative. And the funny thing about that is, in the Capitol, he was the guy pushing for religious liberty and certain, not all of the social, like he was a force, he was trying to block some gun expansions, but for other conservative issues, he was that force throughout. So he was with his party's core conservative base on many of the social issues and on some of the tax issues too. It's just that he had that aura around him to so many people who didn't like him that he was willing to do anything for a vote, and that totally kind of played into it. So that was the moment we started seeing that we knew internally, even if polls weren't picking up immediately, right, that it was going to be a tough road for Casey Cagle in this runoff. I remember hearing from the Kemp's camp that, hey, like in Atlanta, this message had permeated because it was all over the news, but in other parts of the state, they were actually paying money to try to get it out more about the tape because, in other markets, they weren't covering it as much.
Right.
And that most polls showed Kemp up 4, 5, 6, single digits with this pretty solid lead, but single digits. until Trump's endorsement. And that was about 6 days before the election.
Yeah.
It was a Wednesday. I think I remember I was driving home. It was a Wednesday because I was driving home from a radio gig, and we had no clue.
I was getting ready to say, did you have any?
Usually we get heads ups. I believe that when the campaign says they had an inkling that could happen, but they had no clue about the timing or the impact it would have. I mean, I was with Cagle the night before. He had some press conference at his campaign office, and afterwards I was kind of bumming around talking to folks. And I think we mentioned something about Trump, and someone made a joke, well, short of Trump coming in, we feel like we're back on the upswing, was what the Cagle. And I said, Trump's never going to get in this, at this point, right? Like, it's way too, why would you get into a Republican? I get it, of course he's going to, endorse whoever the winner is, but why would you get into this race where both candidates were both supporting Trump? And it's not like one was a never Trumper and the other one was pro-Trump. No, these were both guys who, at least in the run up to the race, had all these glowing things about Donald Trump. And on the way home, I get the buzz on my phone that Trump had endorsed Kemp. I pull over to a coffee shop and burst something. I think I wrote it on my phone first, not while texting and driving, and then pulled over.
That's a law.
I know. Then pulled over a coffee shop, wrote the story up, and it was the next day. I was on the campaign trail with Cagle, and you could it was like the air had just completely gone out of the balloon there. I mean, he did his best. He put on the motions. He said he still had a chance. I mean, think about it from his perspective, a guy who had spent the most of the last decade gearing up for this race. And then in the span, he had made a lot of unforced errors, including the tape. They felt they were within striking distance even after that. But then to have one tweet change it all, right?
And it was right after Governor Deal had that endorsement ceremony. In this day and age, for a Republican governor to be relatively popular across party lines. I mean, we're not Charlie Baker, Larry Hogan numbers, but still a very popular outgoing governor.
You're right. I mean, look, our polls showed him consistently to be the most popular politician in Georgia. He had high approval ratings among Republicans, and he was above the 50% mark among Democrats.
Which is not nothing.
Which is not nothing. And a lot of that's because of criminal justice and his veto of religious liberty. And for Republicans, he did enough too, even though some Republicans were ticked off, he vetoed religious liberty. He also signed several gun expansions into law, passed other socially conservative legislation over his 2 terms. So to have him come in, and those 2 men were never cozy, and those 2 men were never BFFs at all. Even though they're both from Gainesville, even though they both have the same sort of Hall County donor base, they weren't close, and there was a series of run-ins at the legislature where the Senate would block or significantly change legislation that both the House and the governor wanted that sort of helped shape that mutual iciness, which extended to that runoff. I mean, really, if you look at it, I did a story a few weeks before that endorsement saying that Deal had given the quiet signal in a private meeting with his donors to back Cagle over Kemp. But it still wasn't formal. It wasn't some big public rally. It wasn't some big public event. And Deal never did that. Deal never held a rally for Cagle or anything like that. He endorsed him about 8 days before the election, but even that was kind of half-hearted. It was at the end of a press conference on an economic development announcement involving like an Amazon center, where it took a question from me. I mean, he opened it for questions about the business deal, and I said, I see that Lieutenant Governor Cagle is up here with you. Are you planning to wade into this race? And in a very verbose answer for a very verbose governor, but a very verbose answer, he finally said what the Cagle campaign wanted him to say, which was, I endorse, for those reasons, I endorse Casey Cagle. So they got the ad they wanted, they got the visual they wanted, but still, it was completely dwarfed by the Trump effect.
Were you surprised? It was, I think, Kemp carried 157 of our 159 counties. Were you surprised at the magnitude of Cagle's collapse? Yeah,
it was. And there's a backstory to even those 2 counties he didn't carry, which is incredible. But yeah, look, Cagle lost his home county of Hall County. Hall County was we were talking about the suburbs earlier being the backbone for Republicans. Hall County is the backbone for Deal and Cagle. Like, if it wasn't for Hall County's huge support for Deal in 2010,
Right.
it would have been he might not
That
have
was
been,
the Karen Handel
It was the
runoff.
Karen Handel runoff. He might not be governor today, right?
Right.
So I can't remember the specific numbers, but he won Hall by a huge number. In this runoff, he lost Hall. And there's a lot of people in his home county who were upset with him. It wasn't just because of Trump; they were upset for other reasons. But Trump didn't help Cagle, and so yeah, the magnet. We knew it would be. It was kind of like the Abrams-Evans race, which we'll talk about in a sec. But
Yeah.
we knew it was going to be a Kemp victory. Like we knew, but I mean, I'm thinking like 58, 60%, 62, which is still a thrashing.
That's a big win. Yeah.
But once you get to the mid 70s, I mean, give me a break. And the two counties that went for Cagle, one was Stevens County, which was the home to a very well-connected financier who had sued Kemp over a loan, and so that gives us some reason to at least believe that some of the voters there were upset with Kemp
Right.
on behalf of this very prominent Republican. And there was another county, I think it was Monroe County, where in Middle Georgia that Cagle won, and that county had been ticked at Kemp for years because under Georgia law, the Secretary of State is in charge of solving boundary disputes. And Monroe and Bibb had been fighting for years over some commercial plot of land that was like on the border. And Monroe had spent millions of dollars on this in legal fees, and Kemp never decided it. And so they were ticked at just that part of it. And there was the local newspaper there ran ads, has a clock essentially in every edition saying it's been X amount of days since this dispute, and Brian Kemp has still not resolved it. So there was backstories for the two counties he did win, that Cagle did win, and look, that's a thrashing. I mean,
Yeah.
it's hard to ever come back from that.
Right. So you already mentioned the Stacey Evans, Stacey Abrams. What was your approach to that campaign as opposed to sort of this 5-person free for all over on the Republican side, two state representatives on the Democratic? No Jason Carter, no Michelle Nunn, no big name, a legacy name.
Yeah, no legacy name. But Abrams had done a really good job in cultivating her national persona long before that too. I mean, look, we wrote a big story when she got in the race, but so did the Washington Post. I mean, I think they had it in a mutual embargo that we would run the story and the Washington Post would. So it was already interesting enough back then in June, or I think it was June of 2017 when she got in, that the Washington Post was also going to run a story. She had spoken at the Democratic National Convention, not in a very high profile way,
Right.
but had some speaking engagements, and really had already positioned herself as a voting rights sort of expert. But no, she was not the national figure that a famous last name would instantly help make you. But she made herself one, right? So she's there early on in that campaign. There was press conferences for both candidates where I'd be the only reporter showing up. I mean, you couldn't even get local attention. There was one at an elementary school in like late November, early December, where it was a couple cameras from her own campaign and me. There's one press conference early in 2018. She was announcing some endorsement, and again, just like with Governor Deal, like I'll show up at those things, even if it's not a huge story, and I'll get a bunch of questions for other stories I'm writing, and also look, it's good for the candidates to see you're a human being too, and not some faceless entity writing stories they don't like. But it wasn't long until that race just blew up, and for a lot of the national media, it was this easy to characterize as the Stacey versus Stacey, the two Staceys and the different approach, and certainly they had different approaches, and you could see Stacey Evans' approach start to morph near the end. But they both ran their party's progressive flank too. Stacey Abrams had really built a reputation as a pragmatist in the Georgia legislature, including working on a deal in 2011, right after Governor Deal took office, on overhauling Hope Scholarships awards and making it more financially solvent for the long run. That was a deal that a lot of Democrats were very uneasy with, even those Democrats that voted for it. And Stacey Evans was one of the few Democrats that voted against it. Stacey Abrams was in the negotiating room to hash out that compromise. And so that became an instant flashpoint that we covered a lot in Georgia, to the point where the Abrams campaign even released to me a trove of emails from those days because legislative emails and records aren't accessible by the Georgia Open Records Act.
Right.
Only executive ones are, so we don't have access to those. But they gave them to me. And so we were able to write a story kind of reconstructing all that back and forth from those emails. And Evans in a few of those emails even sounded, supportive, at least in the emails, of the deal that Abrams was hashing out until she voted against it. So that was a big flashpoint. But overall, it was an ideological issue. It was a lot about different approaches to the race, their stances on issues. And near the end of that campaign, Stacey Evans was portraying Abrams as sort of a phony liberal, that she was more consistently progressive than Abrams was, that she was the one true progressive in the race. So you saw, just like in the Republicans, how Republicans were moving to the right on everything, from guns to religious liberty to abortion, you name it. They were going to the party's right flank on it in most cases. The Democrats were going to their party's left flank, which is not a crazy phenomenon. It happens.
Right.
But with these two candidates, both kind of portraying the other as somewhat phony, Abrams, for the most part, tried to stay above the fray because the polls were always in her favor. She also was running to be the first black female governor in the nation's history, and the biggest block of the Democratic electorate in Georgia are black women, right, by far. So that was another huge strength of hers, and she was by May, was getting heaps of national attention, and had already had several big time influential Democrats come and campaign for her, while Evans was really struggling to get attention. You'd show up at some of her press conferences, and you'd have half the crowd of reporters that you'd have at Abrams' press conferences as well, and a lot of her more influential supporters who you kept on hearing were going to back her, but were still on the sidelines, never came out. They never ended up endorsing her. Or if they did it very quietly. They donated to her campaign, but they didn't, make a big show of it. And those polls showed it too.
Well, you mentioned there's sort of the establishment in the Republican Party, had been behind Casey Cagle. In the Democratic Party, Roy Barnes had endorsed Stacey Evans. Buddy Darden was her campaign chairman. Vincent Fort endorsed her. Al Scott endorsed sort of that establishment wing of the Democratic Party that goes back to the Miller, Barnes, Pierre Howard days.
Yeah.
Squarely behind Stacey Evans. And again, you get to the primary, and it's a trouncing again.
And the problem too with that, certainly those endorsements helped Evans early on.
Right.
Convince donors to back her, to convince people that she had a path against Stacey Abrams.
Right.
At a time where things looked really iffy for a while for both candidates. But also to a lot of Democrats, especially the Democrats that Abrams was targeting, those big names looked like has-beens, right? Buddy Darden hadn't been in office for a while. Roy Barnes lost gubernatorial races twice since he was governor in 1998, since he won in 1988. Vincent Forrest lost the mayoral race and always kind of had an axe to grind against Stacey Abrams, was never a big Abrams fan. So it became harder to see this as not a even if it wasn't a personal thing, like Abrams people were able to portray Vincent Ford as just being sort of a hater almost.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. So that and also look, early on, Stacey Evans did a really good job raising cash and putting her own cash in to keep pace with Stacey Abrams. And Stacey Abrams wasn't this prolific fundraiser that she ended up being early on, and that happens in campaigns a lot. But she struggled financially early on. She ended up having to donate her own campaign, about $50,000, which ended up becoming an attack line later on, because she also owed about that same amount to the IRS and was on a payment plan. So all these issues sort of kind of melded together. But really, near the end, and the Abrams campaign was brilliant. They had this all set up in a way. But they had the ground game going early on. She invested a lot in the ground game in a way that other candidates could not compare with. She spent 2/3 of her money early on personnel, which was like, in one sense, holy crap. You're not hoarding it for.
That's not how you do things
TV
in Georgia.
Ads. Yeah, it's not how you do things in most states. You're not hoarding it for TV ads and mail and online. You're doing it on personnel, And I went out with some of their door knockers for a story, and you knock on doors, and some people knew who Stacey Abrams was or who Stacey Evans was, and some people were like, "What? There's an election this year? What are you talking about? Stacey who? I know there's two Stacey's running, but I don't know which is which, right?" So there's a lot of voter confusion that early on, and there's a lot of snickering from operatives from both parties saying that's why you don't do that early on, is because you have to go back to those same voters later when they're actually tuning in. But hey, what they did was they seeded the ground early on. And when they did have to go back to some of those voters knew exactly who Stacey Abrams was by July or August, and certainly by October. So that was one thing they did. And the second thing is they had these endorsements, these big endorsements lined up for the very end. And this isn't a shock either. A lot of campaigns do this, but they pulled it off.
Right.
Where they had Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders both endorse like the weekend before. And at that point, I'm starting to hear from the Evans campaign, and there's polls that show Evans in real bad shape. And I'm starting to get leaks from the Evans campaign about internal polls that show her only down by 8. And if you're getting leaks from a candidate saying, oh, they're only down by 8 a couple days before the primary, I mean, that's rough. So we had the same kind of mindset. I was with the Abrams campaign that night, and I kind of went into it thinking, okay, this might be high 50s, low 60s. And instead it was the same. I mean, it was the same as the Republican runoff. It was just thrashing.
Besides the margins of victory for the Republicans and the Democratic candidates, what was the biggest surprise on the primary or runoff election night, down ballot?
In the primary, one of the bigger surprises were, we weren't that surprised about it, but one of the big takeaways was that how well women did. I mean, if it seemed like, and we saw this in the special election in 2017, that women just killed it, just rocked it on the runoff night. I mean, on the runoff in the special election. There was several of the special election runoffs in November and December of 17 were all women races. But the ones that weren't, women won something like 90% of them. And so we saw some of that too, especially in the Democratic primary. We saw candidates that didn't lift a finger. I mean, candidates that did nothing running in state house races beat other candidates, Democratic candidates, who were working their tails off solely, I think, because either their name came first or they were a woman, and the guy they were running against was a man. And we even had, in one case, we had a woman named Sandra Bullock, famous name, who was running against this guy named Eric Allen. Eric had run 2 races before. I think it was 2 races before for a state house seat, a very winnable state house seat for Democrats. It was a Republican-held seat, but it was one of those that were right on the cusp of flipping. And the party leaders really were behind Allen, and Sandra Bullock wins it in a walk, right? I mean, she wins it, and she was one of those candidates that got interested in the campaign because she heard about the run for anything movement, and so she says, okay, I'll run, but wasn't out there in the campaign trail, wasn't really knocking on doors or going gangbusters like that, and ends up winning, and then she ends up dropping out, and Eric's now the state house member. So it worked out for Eric, but that was like one of those moments too. And the other one I think would be the 10th district Democratic race.
Tabitha Johnson
Green, who there was 2 better known candidates that were working it, who were showing up at every forum, who had very big web presences, and were sort of like the battle between the progressive and the like Bernie Sanders socialist, right?
Yeah.
And it turns out this third candidate who wouldn't answer media calls, flagpole, the ranking newspaper here in Athens, the Alt Weekly, couldn't even get a hold of her for a while, and she wins in a walk. Yeah. So I think it was interesting to see how A, women were killing it, and how B, sometimes it didn't matter how hard candidates were working too. Another good example was Cindy Zeldin was she was running for insurance commissioner. she was probably the party's, the secret pick. She put a lot of time and effort. She raised a lot of money, and she ends up getting trounced, and it wasn't even close. And the Democrat who won the party's nomination was not seen as the prolific fundraiser that Cindy Zeldin was. And so that was one of the takeaways. And the other one was still turnout. We saw turnout Democratic turnout get very close to Republican levels,
right?
Which was a really early warning sign for Republicans that, hey, Democrats aren't just talking about being engaged; they really are engaged.
Were you surprised that Josh McCoon wasn't able to even make the runoff in the Secretary of State's race, or that David Schaefer wasn't able to win?
Yeah, I was going to mention those two too. I mean,
I think Schaefer was probably the bigger surprise to me. But what was your take?
Schaefer was sort of the Cagle of the lieutenant governor's race. He was the guy who was supposed to be the LG.
Right.
He was a long-serving state senator who had risen through the ranks of the Republican side of the Senate and became the pro tem. He was going to win the race. He had all the money behind him. He had all these endorsements. He had Ted Cruz. He had all these national endorsements that Georgians don't really care about. But he also had a lot of local endorsements and party leaders and fellow senators. And he was running against two other lawmakers, Rick Jeffries, a fellow senator, and Jeff Duncan, a former state house member. And it goes to show you, I mean, if you asked him, he'd probably say the same thing, but in those races, you can't ever take anything for granted. And had he spent, there's a lot of what ifs, but I don't know if he thought he could win it outright or if he thought that it was going to be a runoff no matter what, but he came so close to winning it outright that if he had spent a little bit more on TV ads or gone to, focus more on this part of Georgia rather than that part of Georgia, there's a lot of what ifs. But he was at 49.8%, right? He was right there, and ends up not making it into the runoff, and then of course losing to Jeff Duncan. And then the Secretary of State's race, Josh McCoon was going to be the conservative firebrand. He had already built up a statewide reputation for being a thorn in the establishment side on many issues and also being a vocal supporter of socially conservative issues. He ran for a unique job because a lot of people would have pegged him as a better candidate for LG or Attorney General. He's a lawyer. But those seats were both either blocked or taken. And so he ran for Secretary of State instead. And he really hadn't built himself a reputation as this voting rights or voting expert, right?
Right.
Electoral expert, I should say, because he had been so socially conservative on so many issues. But look, that didn't stop other secretaries of state from running for that office too. And that was a kind of a mess of a race between a bunch of different candidates who didn't have, other than Josh, who didn't have a very high public profile. And it turns out that the Metro Atlanta guys were the ones who got a lot of the lion's share of the. They spent a lot of money on ads in Metro Atlanta, and they're the ones who got to the runoff.
I guess an interesting what if would have been had he challenged Chris Carr in a straight up primary for Attorney General.
Chris was really shrewd about this. He raised a ton of money his first quarter, right after he was appointed by the governor about a year and a half, 2 years maybe before his first election, and maybe it was a year. I'm getting my
I think it was end of 2016, late 2016.
Yeah, it was end of 2016. I remember this because they were it was Yom Kippur, or it was a Jewish holiday the day he was appointed, so I couldn't be there at the actual thing. So, and I knew this was coming and was going to report it, and they said, hold off, we'll give you the scoop, and we'll give it to you a day early so you don't have to, so you can actually report it. You don't have to worry about missing it because of the Jewish holiday. Right after that, I mean, at that point, there was going to be, because you knew Sam Olens wasn't going to run for re-election no matter what. So you were looking at Josh McCoon running for that, B.J. Pack running for that seat, a lot of prominent Republicans running for that seat. Chris Carr, once he gets appointed, went right to fundraising. So he kind of built a wall. It would have been hard to challenge him effectively, even for a Josh McCoon type character. But man, if Chris wasn't in that job, then McCoon would almost certainly have run for it.
So once we get to the general election, tell me about how you pivot to covering the general as opposed to you've got these two warring camps. Now everybody's back together in a general election. What's general election mode look like for you at the AJC?
The beauty of this race for both candidates is that, unlike in 2010 when Nathan Deal barely beat Karen Handel, or even in 2016 where it was a much closer race between David Perdue and Jack Kingston, this was a walk for both candidates. So there's very little reporting to be done about uniting the Democratic or Republican Party in a sense, right?
Right.
The Democratic Party was certainly behind Stacey Abrams because she won 3-1. She won 76% or something of the vote. And the Republicans have been much more fractured over certain issues. But then in the runoff, when it was such a resounding victory for Brian Kemp, and for a Republican to not stand with Kemp, for a Republican official not to stand with Kemp, also made it look like they were bucking President Trump because he had endorsed Kemp. So we did some stories on unity, and especially on the Republican side, they had this big unity rally, a love fest shortly after that, where Casey Cagle and Brian Kemp shared the stage. But then it shifted to more of the issues stories and really what their tactics were going to be, because the Democrats had spent very little time on attacking Republicans during the primary and runoff, during the primary, and Republicans had spent very little time through the runoff on attacking Democrats. And suddenly, you had this shift where Brian Kemp went after Stacey Abrams from minute one. I mean, from right after he won the party's nomination, whereas Stacey Abrams maintained this above the fray mentality for a while, not through the whole race, but for a while she wasn't going to engage in any sort of frontal attacks on Brian Kemp, wasn't criticizing him unless asked, and even then was somewhat sparing. And it was weird to see that, because those two candidates hate each other. They had been feuding with each other for the better part of a decade over voting issues, and it was, in many senses, the dream matchup for both of them, for each other, because they just had a deep well of animosity toward each other that played out in the courtroom, the campaign trail, fundraising emails, you name it, for years. We did stories in 2016 about how a matchup between Abrams and Kemp would have been, was going to be this explosion of animosity between each other. So to see Stacey Abrams kind of like, sort of hands off of Brian Kemp early was a little bit jarring. Obviously, her surrogates were doing the attacking at that moment. And so then it gets into campaign tactics. It gets into the question of nationalizing the race. What role is Donald Trump going to play? Is he going to come down to Georgia? Where are each candidate's roadmaps to victory? And for Brian Kemp, and that was what some of our coverage revolved around. For Brian Kemp, it was very much the Trump strategy of 2016, which is score big in the rural areas, and that will help you survive doing poorly in the suburbs. And for Stacey Abrams, it was redrawing the map. It was building on Hillary Clinton's gains in the metro suburbs, but also, shoring up DeKalb County in a way that Democrats hadn't, a blue county, but hadn't shored it up in years.
So when was it clear to you that the Kemp campaign had telegraphed that they were not going to contest Cobb, Gwinnett, North Fulton County the way that Republicans had in elections previously?
It was clear to me. They did a series of bus tours in the primary, the runoff, and the general. And in the primary runoff, they barely dipped into the metro suburbs, and in the general, the first of the bus tours stayed as far away from Metro Atlanta as, I think it's went from the Cartersville around Metro Atlanta. And I got this sort of background guidance. Well, we didn't want to, there's a lot of traffic and it could, all this. I was like, that's also where the votes are. That's where the majority of Georgia's population, we're 10 million and 5.
That's why there's a lot of traffic.
Yeah, that's why there's a lot of traffic. The truth is, though, they'd go to Sandersville, Georgia, or Pearson, Georgia, and get 1,000 people. They went to a stop in little town called Rhine, Georgia, 400 people, where they got 1,200 people. Right? They just get these huge crowds in these small towns.
Right.
So it was, and they'd also get unbelievable media coverage from those areas. In Atlanta, had they gone in September or early October on a bus trip tour, they might have been in the C block of the 6 o'clock news. But in Kingsland, Georgia, They're all over the radio there, not necessarily TV there, but they're all over the radio. They're all over. They're on the front page of the newspaper the next day. It's also word of mouth.
The social media impact.
And both candidates are so good at that. They took selfies with everyone, sometimes to their detriment. But they took selfies with everyone, and they encouraged their friends to put it on. And when you're on social media and you see your buddy with a picture with Stacey Abrams or Brian Kemp, but that's when the bus tour sort of was a really shining example, and it made me kind of think, okay, well, look, I mean, at first I thought that Stacey Abrams would struggle more than Hillary Clinton in the suburbs. I still thought she'd win the suburbs, but struggle a little bit more, partly because of questions about her tax issues and things like that I thought would hurt her more in the suburbs than it did. There is a nuance to the argument, though, that Kemp didn't spend as much time in the suburbs, because he didn't spend that much time in the suburbs, but they also spent gobs of money on Metro Atlanta advertising geared mainly towards suburban white women.
With Marty.
Yeah, with Marty. So while they didn't spend a lot of time in Cobb or Gwinnett, they also didn't completely neglect the area.
Right. So what do you think is driving the suburban trend? Because you said you thought Abrams would struggle compared to Clinton. She overperformed Hillary Clinton in those suburbs, or at least the inner suburbs. What is driving that trend towards the Democratic Party?
I mean, part of it's obviously Trump. It's in the Trump era. Trump is everything in these elections, and I talked to many suburban voters for stories who said, "Yeah, I like Stacey Abrams, but I really hate that Trump guy." Right. So part of it's also you had a very effective candidate who was progressive, but she also tailored her message around the three big things that she knew would also appeal to a broader base, which were economy, education, and healthcare. And there's a lot of suburban voters and voters, period, in Georgia who are mystified by Republican opposition to expanding Medicaid. Our polls showed consistently in the high 50s to low 60s% of voters who support expanding Medicaid. So that was an issue that she could latch onto really early on and say that this isn't some progressive liberal issue. This is a mainstream one. Same thing with more tax incentives for small businesses, right? It's the same thing Republicans talk about. So that was seen as a more centrist issue. And boosting the K through 12 spending, everyone's for that, right? I mean, who's going to be against helping your local public school hire more teachers or get more classroom space or whatever it is? Brian Kemp was also for increasing teacher pay. So it was those three issues were issues that I think gave permission for maybe moderate Republican women who were on the fence, like, okay, I don't like Trump, and I also don't really like Stacey Abrams' super progressive parts of her agenda. They might not have been on board with her opposition, her support for gun control or whatever. But look, they might like the Medicaid part of it or the education part of it, or you name it. And also, Brian Kemp found it really hard to, especially early in the general election cycle, to counter with policy proposals that would appeal to the suburban base in a way that, he always talked in broad senses about his 4-point plan and reining in spending and tax cuts and all that. But there is also a need for something more specific for voters, because they did internal polls right after their runoff victory that showed them behind 30 points with suburban white women. I mean, that's a giant hole. And they ended up still being behind double digits, but I think they got within 12 or 30. They got closer in the metrics they wanted to. And part of that was the Marty ads and all those ads, and part of that might have been helped a little bit by the teacher pay raise plan.
So you talked about those the three legs of the progressive stool, basically. Was that similar to Lucy McBath and Carolyn Bordeaux's strategy in the 6th and 7th districts as well?
Yes and no. They also talked a lot about healthcare. Both of them had deep understanding of the healthcare issue for different reasons, and the economy and helping middle class Georgians. The 6th district is so interesting though, because it's one of the more affluent districts in east of the Mississippi, and highly college educated, and so and I think if you polled the 6th District like they did, and the AJC was never able to poll the 6th District in the 2018 cycle, but you can see a lot of concern. I think you'd see a lot of concern among even some Republicans over the gun issue. And Lucy McBath had such a personal connection to that in a way that it was sort of an unimpeachable personal connection to it because of what happened to her son. Her son was gunned down, as you know, in Florida while he was when he was a teenager. And so I think that helped too. But also, frankly, the Kemp struggles, obviously, and the Abrams success helped carry the top of the ticket. And if you look next door in the 7th District, there's a lot of Republican angst over the fact that Rob Woodall wasn't doing as much as the state and national figures wanted him to do in terms of shoring up his campaign. He only ran an advertisement the final days of the campaign. He was not campaigning as much or as effectively as his critics wanted him to do, as his Republican critics wanted him to do. So I was hearing a lot from folks in the run-up to that vote. A lot of people are frustrated and angry. And in some sense, it could have hurt Handel too, because if you think about it this way, Carolyn Bordeaux is running, barrage of ads attacking Rob Woodall. Rob's never answering them. And those same ads bleed over to the 6th District too. I live in the 6th District. I saw them ads just as much as the 7th District people saw too. And without an answer up there, it could have hurt other suburban Republicans as well. And look, in general, you saw Republican suburban, what's left of the moderate-ish caucus of the Republican Party in Georgia and the legislature was almost all wiped out.
Yeah, there's, I think, maybe five state legislators that are Republicans in Abrams districts, something like that. Don't quote me on that, but I think it's 5 or 6. And we can talk about what that means for the legislature. Bartow, Cherokee, Forsyth counties, that's really the backbone of the Republican Party now. It's not Cobb, it's not Gwinnett, certainly not DeKalb like it was in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Why are those outer suburbs, those northern exurbs, why are they still reliably 70-30 Republican counties?
Those are the areas where the suburbanites who used to live in Gwinnett County and Fulton County, and of course not all the suburbanites used to live there, but
sure.
But those are where you can find good schools, where you can find more bang for your buck in terms of housing, and where a lot of wealthier conservatives can move who don't have to necessarily worry about the long commute to Atlanta. Who might work from home or might have executive jobs where they don't have to go to work as much. So that's happening as those areas are getting denser, right? I mean, people make the joke about 85 just being sort of like, especially for well-to-do young people and immigrants too, moving to Atlanta and kind of going up the 85 corridor from Atlanta to Gwinnett County into the outlying exurbs and up to Hall County too. I mean, Hall County is another one of those backbones still that has become increasingly red. And look, that's what we saw. We saw those exurbs just as the core metro Atlanta counties, that's what we call them at least, the core metro Atlanta counties got bluer, the exurbs got redder, and really the red counties in general got redder.
Right.
And so that's where you have a very strong strain, pro-Trump strain. That's where Trump picked up a lot of his support. That's how Rob Woodall won that seat. It was Gwinnett County, he got clobbered in Gwinnett County, but he dominated in Forsyth County, and Forsyth County is an 80-20 Trump county. And I don't remember what margins he won his portion of Forsyth County by, but they were big.
Right. Well, that begs the question, when do we get to the tipping point where that demographic change and population growth in core metro Atlanta, the cities around Georgia, when does it finally outpace rural Georgia? And is the Republican performance sustainable in rural and exurban Georgia?
One of the things that Stacey Abrams was key to do, and it helped her, I mean, it's hard to tell how much it helped her by, but a lot of Democrats do focus just on metro because that's where the votes are. She did visit every single county in Georgia and planted an operation in many of them. I mean, long neglected party apparatus in parts of Georgia where there's not that many votes were kind of resuscitated in a way. She'd go to Ben Hill County and and other places that haven't been visited by Democratic candidates in years, and get like 1,000 people to show up at restaurants for her. You're not going to make repeat visit after repeat visit to these
Sure.
sparsely populated counties, but you're able to sort of start cutting some of your losses. It's a game of what if. She got demolished in a lot of these counties. She may have gotten demolished even more had she not visited them at all. And of course, near the end of the campaign, a gaffe that Republicans made much use of, where she said essentially people shouldn't have to go into agriculture to make a living, really came back to haunt her.
Very reminiscent of Guy Milner.
Yeah.
Do you farm or do you work for a living?
Yeah, exactly. And she instantly knew that. You could see in her eyes she instantly knew that was a gaffe, and her campaign certainly did, and corrected it on Twitter, and it didn't matter because the Republicans had their like clip that they would run over and over again. And what was interesting to me about that, by the way, was that I wrote about it obviously in Atlanta. You didn't see much other coverage of it. Certainly the national media, which was bordering on obsessed with Stacey Abrams and every move she made. And also the voting issues that Kemp faced, but with very little coverage of that gaffe. But despite that, everywhere you'd go in rural Georgia, every time Kemp would go somewhere, he didn't need to bring it up. I mean, it was like a laugh line. He'd be in these small towns all over southwest Georgia or southeast Georgia, and he'd say something like, "Well, you guys all heard, what Stacey Abrams thinks. She thinks that your food comes from a grocery store," and people would chuckle, and then he'd bring up that gaffe, and everyone was kind of nodding along. Like he didn't need the media to cover it because it was all over the social media to conservatives all over rural Georgia. So the question was, where's the tipping point? I think most Republicans you talk to today would say this ain't going to work again in 2020. Like Brian Kemp did it just enough to, like that formula worked maybe one last time. He wrung out every vote he felt he could in rural Georgia to counteract Metro Atlanta's increasing blue dot. But more people were coming to Metro Atlanta than they are coming to rural Georgia.
And this was a midterm. Where Democrats historically underperform. Exactly.
So David Perdue and the Republicans up for 2020 are that's what they're freaking out about now. And they know they have to. It's a very different race too, because let's say for one, Perdue's an incumbent who's more popular within the party than Kemp was when he started running. And secondly, he has like the powers of an incumbency and Trump's ear.
Right.
So it'll be who knows what's going to happen over the next 2 years. But Republicans definitely see that they need to shore up conservative, the suburban Georgia, and they might not ever win Gwinnett County again. I mean, Gwinnett County went 57%. I shouldn't say ever again, but they might not win Gwinnett County in the next couple cycles, but they can cut their losses in Gwinnett County. They can cut their losses in Cobb County, and also. Look, if you're Democrats and you want to ever take back the state house, you've got to do better in rural Georgia. If you look as great as the Democrats did in suburban Atlanta, and they flipped about a dozen seats in the House and 2 seats in the state Senate, they lost their 2 seats in Athens, which is rural-ish. I mean, Athens isn't rural, but like the surrounding areas.
Yeah, the 117th and 119th are.
Yeah, Coney County and surrounding areas are rural. And then they lost their seat in Sumter County, which is Jimmy Carter's home county that they had won, the Democrats won 2 years ago and were so proud of, went right back to the Republican fold with Mike Chiokas, who I just saw this morning. So he won that seat back. So they know that, look, Democrats can win every single Metro Atlanta seat and still, or most Metro Atlanta seats, I should say, in the close-in suburbs and still not have control of the Georgia House, because there's only about 6 or 7 more they need to take.
That was the Georgia Republicans know that very well.
Yep.
They held those for 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
And it was never enough. What do you make of the fact of how close the top of the ticket, how little drop off there were in individual races? I think Gary Black had a high of about 53%. The low on the Republican end would have either been Brad Raffensperger or Chuck Eaton at 49 and change. That's not a lot of drop off.
No.
It's very uniform in voting, something that I guess has been getting more and more uniform. But what's your take on that issue?
I mean, look, again, I think a lot of it goes back to the power of personality and Trump. And there's a lot of straight ticket Democratic voters that were voting in races they paid very little attention to. And a lot of Republicans are doing the same thing down the ticket. It was no matter what. You didn't see that many split tickets. I'll put it this way. When I saw signs in someone's yard of, let's say, like a Chris Carr and Stacey Abrams, I would take note of it. I'd like go pull over and take a picture, because you don't see too many people, at least openly, saying they're splitting their ticket. Also, part of that, there were vote drop-offs, obviously.
Right.
There weren't too much percentage drop-offs, but the LG race had about 100,000 fewer votes than
the mystery.
Yeah, which I don't know how much of a mystery it is. There's reasons for that too, but whatever. There's a legal case that will help decide that. But in terms of, you also saw libertarians really flail in Georgia. You had we've had in governor races and Senate races, we've had a series of libertarians that like worked their butts off and were at forums and campaigns and had real operations, even if they were only going to get 3 or 4% of the vote.
Right.
And this race, you had a libertarian that didn't. I mean, he just didn't have any semblance of a campaign operation. Was sending tweets about shortly before the race, urging people to back his GoFundMe account so he could get out of the race and make sure there was no runoff. Right. He ended up deleting that tweet, but you didn't have a very credible libertarian candidate. He fought through cancer and had tremendous backstory, but in terms of campaign operation, couldn't hold a candle compared to other libertarians who ran before him, who really worked their tails off. And there's probably reasons for that, and I don't really know them. But you also saw libertarian support. While it grew down the ticket, I don't think a single libertarian candidate got over 3%. So that just also talks to
I think Duval was the most.
Yeah, which was
2.25, give or take.
So that shows you how polarized the race is too. If sometimes libertarians are the safe haven for people who don't like either candidate, and they might not even know who the libertarian is, but they just check the libertarian box. In this race, especially in the governor's race, but even down the ticket, you had very little of that. You just had intense party polarization, and I think if people didn't like either candidate, they just didn't vote in it.
What were your takeaways from the runoff, Secretary of State and Chuck Eaton's Public Service Commission seat?
It's still a Republican-leaning state. It is. It might not be like that in 2020, but you saw Democrats. You saw the suburban sweep that helped Democrats in the general election just kind of evaporate. I think Lindy Miller actually ended up winning Cobb County. John Barrow didn't. And obviously in Gwinnett County, also went more solidly towards Republicans. I think it was much closer margin, but Republicans also did much better in Gwinnett County than they did in the general. And look, the most reliable voting block for runoffs are your core voters, but also it tends to be a much more wider, older, less diverse electorate. And early voting kind of showed that. You had like 50% plus who were older. You had a dramatically less diverse electorate, and that really hurt. And frankly, there was a lot of voter fatigue. This has been for us a year, 2 years basically of nonstop campaigns, and voters. I think the core progressive voters who got behind Stacey Abrams, it was hard to get behind a centrist Democrat who hadn't gotten that much attention, whose only campaign ad right before the general was, "I'm a Democrat, but I won't bite you." Right? It was a very different message than Stacey Abrams, which is, "I'm proudly a progressive," where this is a centrist guy who voted against Nancy Pelosi and voted for gun rights expansions. So even though those issues have nothing to do with the Secretary of State's race, they showed again that they basically showed again why Republicans are in no hurry to get away with the runoff system.
Yeah, even though Republicans won both races by about 4 points, is there something to be said for even in a 22% turnout, for those races, Democrats were still only lost by 4 points?
Yeah, right. I mean, 48's the new high water mark in a way of what a candidate can do, sort of. I wouldn't say at the lowest level or anything like that, but for a while it was the Denise Majette, Johnny Isaacson race, which was an 04 for Senate, which showed you what a Democrat with very little campaign operation and very little funding could do without really doing much, which was not great. I think she got low 40s. She might have gotten around. Now, and this is not to disparage Lindy Miller or John Merrick, because they worked their butts off and they did have sprawling campaign operations, but this was a very low turnout race. Now that mark could be in the high 40s. And with a transformative candidate who can really energize voters in a way that previous Democratic candidates couldn't do, like Stacey Abrams, you can get to 49.
Right.
Right? Can you get to 50? We'll find out in 2020.
Well, what do you think? We've talked about it briefly. The composition of the legislature now. The Republicans still have a majority, but it's a decreased majority in the House and Senate. Much more rural, much more exurban, less moderate. How's that going to affect the legislature, which we've seen over the past few years is very much of a pro-business, pro-growth, establishment, Nathan Deal-esque Republican Party.
But also sprinkling in some social legislation, right?
Sure.
Even though Deal vetoed religious liberty, he signed campus gun, he signed abortion restrictions, he signed immigration crackdowns.
Yeah.
So, but he did many of those in his first term. And
Right.
people were kind of, campus carry was second term, but many of those other things were first term, so people kind of forget about them. So you're going to see, look, a couple things that Brian Kemp promised that he's going to fulfill. He made himself the rural candidate for governor. He made himself the champion of agriculture. Now he's got to live up to that, right? In a way that Metro Atlanta lawmakers, it isn't their top priority. They're all supportive of helping rural Georgia, but it's not on the tip of the tongue for a lot of Metro Atlanta lawmakers. Period. As important as it is, so he's got to do something for that rural base that got him here, right? So that's going to be an interesting struggle issue with the Metro Atlanta Republicans that remain, and of course the new Metro Atlanta Democrats, who again think those issues are super important, but they're not on their top 3 list of priorities.
Right.
For them it might be transportation, you name it. Other issues that are education. Other issues that are more salient to them. That's a big one. Also, Democrats now have gone from a nadir of in the 50s, low 60s in terms of legislative strength to now they're at 75. And that means that Republicans are far from a constitutional amendment proof majority.
Right.
They need some Democratic help. And look, and the Republican caucus isn't as reliable as it once was. It's hard to corral all Republicans, especially when you have so many fiscal conservatives and maybe sort of remnants of the Tea Party movement, just straight up no votes, people who don't vote yes for anything. So it's going to be a lot harder to see. It's going to be a lot harder for Democrats. Republicans are going to have to work more to get Democrat. And I think you're going to see a Brian Kemp who's going to try to engage a lot more on a personal level with lawmakers. Not to say Deal didn't. And Deal had a great track record for the bills he cared about of getting them passed. There's very few bills that he cared about that didn't get passed. And look, maybe his biggest defeat was the school takeover bill. And he got it passed in the legislature. The voters didn't like it. So Kemp is going to have to engage more with lawmakers in a way because he's got more Democrats who are untrusting of him. And already you're seeing talk of a boycott of his speech.
So what do you make of the makeup of his transition team? And I think he announced either Thursday or Friday his floor leaders.
Yeah.
What's your takeaway of the composition of those two groups?
I mean, look, so far, after such a divisive election, nationally, sometimes you expect a president with such a divisive win to go and reach across party lines and to pluck some Democrats up. You didn't see Trump necessarily do that. With Kemp, you haven't seen that quite yet either. I'm not saying it's not going to happen. I'm not ruling it out. And he certainly hasn't. But his first interviews and his first moves as the governor-elect have all been towards catering towards the conservative bloc of the party that got him here. Those are the people who were with him the earliest. Those are the people that voted for him in the primary and the runoff, and in rural Georgia, and those conservative elements of the party were also what got him across the finish line.
Right.
So I get it on one sense, but in terms of governing, there's a lot of Democrats and then also privately Republicans who are grumbling about the fact that, hey, he might need to do a little bit more reaching out. His transition team were all very conservative, mostly older men, but there was also some diverse members of that committee too. But they're very well-known Republicans. He didn't pick a Democratic state lawmaker, for instance, to be on that committee. He didn't pick a well-known liberal activist. And I don't know that he would. And look, I don't know that you'd have asked Roy Barnes to do the same in 1998 after his election victory. But this was such a close one that I wouldn't rule out him making some sort of more olive branch moves to Democrats, because his reelection campaign's already started too.
Right.
When you win by that narrow of a margin, you can't afford to rest.
Well, what do you, on the Democratic side, you had, Stacey Abrams had this very long, coattails, but also a shadow that she sort of casts over the entire party. And one of the first moves the Democratic caucus makes is to defeat a very well-known, strong supporter of Stacey Abrams in Carolyn Hughley and reelect Bob Trammell, the only Democrat who carried a Brian Kemp district, as their minority leader. What gives there? What's going on in sort of that internal caucus politics, and what can it tell us, more broadly about the state of Democratic politics?
One of the things that Stacey Abrams did when she was elected House Minority Leader, she expanded the staff of that caucus in a major way. I mean, they hired a lot of people. They really amped up their outreach efforts and their media efforts, and it was there wasn't a lot to show for it in terms of gains. Party gains,
Right.
I think they netted a few seats, but it wasn't that many. But Abrams, it's a really tough job, right? Because as fractious as the Republican caucus is, the Democratic caucus is equally fractious, and they've got a lot of issues as well with, the dwindling number of conservative, somewhat conservative, more rural lawmakers, urban lawmakers who have totally different priorities from the new caucus of suburban lawmakers. So there's all these things there. But Carolyn Hughley was going to be, to some lawmakers, they saw it as more of the same. They saw her as, Abrams 2.0, and they didn't like that. They didn't want the caucus to be run like it was. They were worried about the expenses and the staff and all this. And secondly, there's some other members who just thought that Bob Trammell gave a different sort of face to the caucus in terms of helping to appeal to rural voters in a way that a suburban or urban lawmaker would have a hard time doing. And I think it was going to be a tough argument to tell caucus members to switch horses right after under Bob Trammell, whether or not it had anything to do with Bob.
Right.
Right? I mean, look, Stacey Abrams was the top of the ticket, so it had a lot to do with her. Obviously, probably overwhelming a lot to do with her. But still, Democrats were able to pick up about 13 seats in the House. So to oust the guy right after, he was at least in charge of that effort, would have been tough. So I don't necessarily see it as too much of a slap in the face to Abrams, although her allies were certainly very, very vigorous about making that case. I don't know if Stacey Abrams made any calls. I'm sure she did. But certainly Lauren Groh-Wargo, her campaign manager, was tweeting about it and was very vocal about it. And a lot of Stacey Abrams' allies were pushing for Carolyn Hughley.
And on the Republican side, Bill Cowsert, Brian Kemp's brother-in-law, was demoted from his post as Senate Majority Leader. What happened there?
There's a lot of Kemp, as far as I can tell, stayed out of this one. And this is internal Senate caucus. And Cowsert's name was briefly mentioned for an open Georgia Supreme Court seat for a little while. So he had sent, I guess that was a signal enough that there is life for him beyond his Senate role. But look, there was a lot of concern about whether or not he was conservative enough, about his ideology, and about whether or not he could effectively lead what is another very fractious caucus. I mean, you talk about, and it's smaller because the Senate is smaller, but you talk about a lot of dueling personalities. That is where some of the Georgia's largest and most vibrant personalities go to roost.
Right.
And it's hard to manage that group. And you had Dugan run as someone who says he was going to be a more effective leader and really listen to lawmakers' concerns and then get them executed. I mean, get them done. Get those plans done in a way that they thought that Kaushard couldn't. A lot of Kaushard's critics saw him as a roadblock rather than someone who would speed legislation through. Whether that's not true or not, I mean, a lot of that stuff goes on behind the scenes, but I definitely don't see that as a rebuke to Kemp either, because Kemp did nothing publicly to sort of try to influence that outcome. And I think it would have been a mistake for him to do that as the governor, to try to wade into caucus politics is tough.
Right. Well, we could probably spend all day talking about what's going to come out of the next legislative session, which is just over a month away, give or take.
Yeah. Don't remind me.
But right. But let's finish on some relatively breaking news. Everybody and their brother expected Nick Ayers to be the new White House Chief of Staff. Not going to happen. Nick's going to be coming back to Georgia. What's that mean for sort of the Georgia-Trump pipeline and also the future of Ayers in Georgia politics?
Look, we're going to be writing about Ayers for a long time
to
come. He flirted with a run for governor last year. I even wrote a story. He had people lined up to support him, including very prominent Trump supporters here. He has a lot of money. He has a lot of connections. He has a lot of IOUs from people who owe him a lot, and probably starting with Brian Kemp, because we know Sonny Perdue was one of the people behind Trump's endorsement of Kemp, but I bet Nick Ayers is right there with him. And certainly Nick played a big role in getting both Pence and Trump down to Georgia those final few weeks of the general election cycle. And Pence also came in the final week of the runoff cycle too, and that was all to do with Pence as well. I mean, with Ayers as well. So Ayers isn't going anywhere. The question for him is, what role is he going to play, right? I mean, he's already fabulously wealthy, and certainly he could expand on that fortune. And it looks like he's going to run a super PAC for Donald Trump, and still stay involved in that. But that won't be his only venture. And look, in 4 years, in 6 years, and however many years, does he want to run for office? I don't think, he's certainly not going to challenge his cousin in 2020 or anything like crazy like that for Senate. But there's going to be some openings down the road, and Georgia is a super competitive state now, and it's going to be getting a lot more media attention in 2020. There's a good case that Georgia can make for being a battleground in a way that Ohio used to be. Right, with about as many electoral votes. And different sort of size of media markets, but different issue set, but still like a very competitive state. And Nick is going to be right in the middle of all that, I think.
Well, Greg, I've kept you here far too long already, but thank you again on behalf of the Richard B. Russell Library for sitting down and talking history and politics with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.
No problem.